Good afternoon. We're live from the United Nations. I want to begin. I'm Akshaya Kumar, Deputy United Nations Director at Human Rights Watch, by thanking the UN Correspondents Association for once again hosting us to launch our latest Human Rights Watch research here from UN headquarters in New York. It's my pleasure to be accompanied by our emergencies researcher, Jonathan Pedno, and our Executive Director of the Africa Division, Mausi Shegun, who will be speaking to our findings related to the worrying situation in Cameroon's Anglophone regions. Without any further ado, especially because we've been delayed by half an hour, thank you for tuning in, and thank you to those who are watching on Facebook Live. I'd like to turn it over to Mausi to set the context and set the stage for the event.
Thanks, Akshaya, and thank you, everyone, for joining us this afternoon. As many of you in the room know, that since late 2016, we have seen the Republic of Cameroon, a hitherto oasis of stability and peace in the Central Africa region that has been bedeviled by civil wars in neighboring countries like Chad, in Central African Republic, and the Congos, suddenly begin to degenerate into a crisis of its own. What initially started as civil protests, largely peaceful, by lawyers, teachers, students, in this multicultural country. The protests were about the perception of marginalization and discrimination by the authorities in Yaoundé. Unfortunately, these protests and demonstrations, which are protected rights under international law, they were met by very heavy-handed response by the Cameroonian authorities. This fueled the anger of local people in Cameroon's northwest and southwest regions. And soon, there began an agitation for the region's independence. I mean, this is a pattern that we have seen almost everywhere else. In our work in Africa, across the world, where we document over and over every time that government employs violence in response to civil action, it inevitably invites corresponding violence on the part of non-state actors. This is why we're here today. In less than 2 years, that situation has degenerated. And we, Human Rights Watch, watching how the situation was escalating, decided to send in our researchers to travel into Cameroon and document first-hand accounts from the victims and witnesses and others that have been affected by the violence. In April, Jonathan, my colleague here, and another colleague who is not here, our Children's Rights Deputy Director, Children's Rights Division Deputy Director, they were in the southwest and the northwest region, traveling from village to village, talking to people, families of people who have been killed, tortured, students, teachers whose schools have been burned or properties destroyed. Across this region, hundreds of people affected in many parts of this region. But like I said earlier, the perpetrators are not just government agents. those who have been involved in the pressure for independence have also been, unfortunately, credibly implicated in abuses themselves, including intimidation, threats, and other abuses, including killings and the burning of schools and other properties, extortion as well, setting up roadblocks. Once we were done from the field, we realized that as bad as the situation that we documented was, that there was still room to stop this from escalating further. And so we reached out to Cameroonian authorities and to other partners across the world, including the UN. And I have to say that we were gratified by the openness of the Cameroonian authorities to engage with us. We have received both informal and formal responses to our queries and requests for further information. We have seen some progress. For example, the 47 separatist leaders who were arrested, some of them from Nigeria and from elsewhere, who had been held in incommunicado in Cameroonian prisons, were allowed visits by family members and their lawyers for the first time. We believe that there is room for negotiation. We believe that there is room for dialogue. And we want to use this report to open the eyes of the world to what is going on in Cameroon, and hopefully to get the buy-in of the Cameroonian authorities and the separatists to give peace and dialogue a chance. Jonathan has more details to share with you about his findings on the ground, a lot of which we corroborated with the use of technology, using satellite imagery analysis and the verification of videos and photographs and other materials that he got from Cameroon. We'll start with a video, and then Jonathan will speak to it.
There's a crisis unfolding right now in the western regions of Cameroon.
It was on the 1st of October when gendarmes just came in, started beating us, destroying things in the house, and gave me this mark on the hand. Since then I feel terrible. I hate to see any gendarme, anybody in uniform.
These are regions that are known traditionally to be Anglophone regions in a bilingual country, a country that speaks both French and English, in which the majority is Francophone, French-speaking. In 2016, Anglophone teachers, lawyers went down into the streets to protest government decisions, to ask for more Anglophone teachers and lawyers to be deployed to their areas. These demonstrations were met with a very heavy-handed response from the government. People were picked up in the streets, beaten up. Government used live ammunition against protesters. All of that contributed to a hardening of the situation and the positions of the leaders of the Anglophone community, who went on to eventually create a number of armed factions asking and fighting for independence. Since 2017, they have started to attack government facilities, government officials, and have also been attacking schools, preventing children from going to their classes. We have had cases of security forces being beheaded, being killed in atrocious manners. All of this in order to make it difficult for the government to hold control over this area.
The driver of the car and the driver from Wabane.
And the government has deployed security forces in order to quell what they see as an existential crisis, using extremely problematic and illegal tactics.
Just look at what is happening in Kwakwa. People are dying. All houses have been burnt down. Look at human beings. Oh Lord, please, please, please.
We have been able to verify the assertions of the people that we spoke to through our satellite work, and we were able to identify at least 20 villages that had been burned by security forces. We've seen villages in which over 700 structures had been destroyed by arson. We have over 150,000 people who have been displaced from their homes. Clearly, in the case of Cameroon, we have a situation that has been going from worse to worse to worse. And it's important that the international community not only takes note of what is happening, but also pressures the government of Cameroon, as well as these separatist groups, to stop attacking civilians.
Thank you. I'm happy to turn it over to Jonathan to launch our latest report. For those who are just joining us, this report is "These Killings Can Be Stopped: Government and Separatist Abuses in Cameroon's Anglophone Regions." And Jonathan, our emergencies researcher, has recently returned from Cameroon himself, where he's made a research mission and also an advocacy mission. Jonathan, thank you.
If there is one place where I did not expect to be documenting the type of violence that we are here to talk about today, it's probably Cameroon. For most of my career thus far, Cameroon has been, as Mauzi was saying, an island of stability in a sea of otherwise very troubled countries, places where lots of abuses have been taking place. And therefore, it was very much a surprise for us when we went finally to Cameroon to verify the assertions that that had been communicated to us by several people, by several sources. It was very much of a surprise for us to discover how bad the situation truly was. I spent 3 weeks in the western, in the southwest and northwest regions of Cameroon. This was a difficult mission for us to accomplish. People were extremely afraid. People were not forthcoming at all, which is not necessarily quite usual with crisis situations. Those are situations in which usually people are very much forthcoming, really much want to tell their stories, whereas in Cameroon right now, the people we met were thoroughly afraid. It was very difficult research for us to accomplish. Nonetheless, over these 3 weeks, we managed to meet with over 80 people. And these 80 people painted a picture of a situation that has indeed been going from worse to worse to worse. And the reason for that, as Mauzi was saying, is in large parts because we have been faced now in the context of Cameroon with two parties, with two sets of ideas that do not want to talk, that do not want to negotiate in good faith, and have been using, therefore, violence to resolve these issues. Therefore, squeezing in between a vulnerable population, a population that has never really been acquainted with armed violence in the past, a population that is extremely vulnerable to violence, but also very much traumatized by the amount of violations that have been taking place now, especially since late 2017. Without going back into the historical details of this situation, this is something that I'm open, obviously, to discuss about later on. I'd like to share perhaps with you a few of the stories that we've heard. And it's important to stress that the people that we met, you know, they're single mothers living at home, they're teachers, professors, they're students, they're not activists, they're not, civil society leaders. They're not the kind of people who are out there with an agenda. They're the kind of people who are out there because they don't have a house anymore, because they've been forced out of their communities, because their houses have been burnt. And they came to us to tell us not only about abuses committed by government forces, government security forces, but also by members of their own communities who have chosen to take up weapons and have not only been attacking government forces, but also civilians using extremely problematic tactics. Just an example of that. I mean, for the last 2 years now, you have tens of thousands of children who have been unable to get to school. What is the reason for that? The reason for that is that you have armed people and very extremely minded people who have decided to prevent schools from resuming in the region. The goal for that is to make the region ungovernable. They've been attacking francophone schools, bilingual schools, anglophone schools, religious schools, state schools, name them. There's at least 58 schools that have been attacked thus far, and that's according to UNICEF. We ourselves documented at least 12 attacks on these schools. And the general pattern is, people, children, teachers would go to school in the morning and then they would find a part of the buildings destroyed because, arson had been committed. We've also spoken to principals and teachers who told us that they had been receiving written threats, leaflets left in the schoolyard in front of their homes saying, if the school resumes, we might attack your school. If the school resume, do you really want us to come and burn it? We've had examples on social media. We've seen some of those leaflets, some of those threats. Those are absolutely non-permissible actions by any group whatsoever. Children should always be allowed to go to school. Now you have at least 32, perhaps up to 40,000 children in both regions who have been out of school for 2 years. And despite the government's attempts at maintaining the exams, for instance, this year we've still seen threats of violence by armed separatists against children, against their relatives. To give you another example of the kind of violence that has been exerted by these groups, and that is an extremely worrying trend for us. We met with francophone Cameroonians who live in those areas in the southwest, people from an ethnic group called the Bameleke, who are very much present in both regions. And they explained to me how they had been singled out within their own community by some of these groups, some of these more extreme factions, taken to the bases, beaten up, asked for money. They were accused of supporting the government, and eventually they had to flee. They had to flee because life was made unbearable by the presence of these armed groups operating in those areas. Those are armed groups that have also been extorting money out of people, that have been kidnapping civilians, that have been kidnapping state workers. So this is obviously not only a security threat, obviously, for the government of Cameroon, but also increasingly a threat for civilians living in those areas. Now the problem, and that's really the problem, because ultimately in a situation such as this one, the government of Cameroon still has the primary responsibility for protecting civilians. We are talking not about the non-international armed conflict at the moment, because we are not clear on how present, on how big these forces actually are. And that requires a normal, an even higher threshold of precautions by the government of Cameroon when responding to this crisis. This is something that we explained to the government when we met with them. Now the problem, what we've been seeing, is in fact quite the opposite. We've been seeing security forces, more and more so since December, January of this year, going to various villages, often in retaliation for attacks by groups of armed separatists against convoys or against small gendarme or police or army bases. We've seen these convoys of security forces driving to a village. People described to me how they saw early in the morning the trucks, carrying soldiers, parking in the middle of the village, and then starting to shoot. Obviously, the typical reaction to that is to flee. And so many people that I met, described to me how they took their children, they took whatever they had at hand, fled to the forest, and a few hours later, hearing gunshots, hearing cries, they saw smoke rising above the canopy. And when they returned to their village, hours later, what they found was destroyed neighborhoods, destroyed homes, destroyed livelihoods. And in some cases, we documented at least 4 of those cases, relatives who had been burnt alive in those fires. We documented 4 cases of older women who were unable to flee when these security forces came to the village and set fire to the homes and burnt alive in horrible circumstances. The son of one of these women, whom I met in the southwest, told me how he was on his way back to his village the day that the attack took place in February. You know, he was stopped at a checkpoint by the army at the bridge. He was about to cross to go back home. He clearly understood that something was not right. He was hearing gunshots, seeing smoke above the village. And when the next day was finally allowed to go into the village to proceed on the road, he got home, or to whatever was left of his home, found ashes, and only found the head and the intestines of his mother. You know, and this was extremely traumatizing for him, for other people in the village. This is one example of the kind of violence that we've been documented. You know, we also spoke to this other woman, for instance, a teacher, single mother with 3 kids, 2 kids, 3 kids, who you know, had been saving money for 10 years to build her own home in the Northwest. She built the home. She was very well seen by the people in the village because she was the one person who succeeded, you know, going abroad to Yaoundé, to Douala to make out a living. And so she was living with her parents. One day she goes out to the field. She hears, you know, people shouting at her, telling her to come back. The house is on fire. Why is the house on fire? Because security forces had just come to arrest her parents, her elderly parents. Security forces basically came that day to arrest both her mother and her father because they were looking out for her nephew. This is called proxy detention, and this is illegal. You cannot arrest members of the family in order to get to someone else. Nonetheless, security forces did that, brought the parents over to the main town, to the station, and then the daughter, the person who owned the house, had to go to the gendarme station and was asked to pay a bribe in order to release her parents. Not only had she lost her house, had her elderly parents arrested, and then she was also asked for money, a sensible sum of money in order to release her parents. So those are examples of the kind of violence that is now creeping in the region, in Cameroon. Again, this is a country that was known for its stability, a multicultural, bilingual country, one that was key and remains key for security in the region. And yet we're seeing it tick all of the boxes that we usually see before we enter a protracted phase, the protracted phase of a conflict, the time when diplomats and journalists say, oh, this is terrible, this is a terrible situation, why did we not do something beforehand? So now we still have a little bit of a window. The government of Cameroon has been very engaging in its response to our findings. We were able to go to Yaoundé. We met with 8 senior government officials, including one of the top advisors at the presidency. We had very long meetings with them in which we were exchanging very frankly about how we saw the situation, about the findings that we gathered. And the government pledged to conduct a number of investigations. We have received in this report a written response from the government of Cameroon in which it details 3 of such cases. But in general, the response of the government has been to tell us, well, you know, you have some rotten apples here and there. You know, soldiers are traumatized or deployed away from their families. They get attacked by these people moving in the forest, in the villages. So sometimes you may have 1 or 2 people doing something they shouldn't be doing. The reality is that now we have 20 villages that we've been able to identify as showing signs of destruction consistent with arson. When I say consistent with arson, it's because we can clearly see that the structures are burnt in one place and then the fire jumps, you know, past the trees, past obstacles to another house nearby, but still it doesn't burn the tree, meaning that, you know, it's not just a case of a house being burnt and then the wind carrying it around. There's clearly someone transferring the fire. And this is very much consistent with the testimonies that we gathered in the field. And so we've been asking the government of Cameroon now not only to, you know, tell people like us, tell people like Human Rights Watch, a foreign organization, what they've been doing to deal with the situation. We've been urging them to communicate that openly and transparently to their population. It's one thing to try and preserve the morale of the forces fighting in those areas. It's another to try and preserve the morale of the population that is currently facing the bulk of these actions, that is currently paying the price for these illegal tactics being carried out. The government has to come clean. The government has to engage much more forcefully and carry out accountability, provide accountability for the crimes that have been committed in those areas. I'll leave it here, and
thank you for those remarks, Jonathan, and for so vividly and viscerally describing some of the research that you've done, but also the conclusions we were able to draw by using satellite imagery and analyzing videos. Before I open it up to questions from the press corps who are assembled here, I wanted to make one point, which I think comes quite clearly from what both Jonathan and Mausi have said, which is, as the title of this report says, these killings can be stopped. We at Human Rights Watch believe that this is a case for prevention, and here at the United Nations we often hear talk of prevention, but very little action on a situation like Cameroon. And so Human Rights Watch is recommending that the UN Security Council request a briefing by the Secretary General on the situation in Cameroon, demand an end to these human rights violations, and make clear that further abuse will lead to targeted sanctions, including against the individuals who are credibly implicated in these serious violations. We also flag that the Human Rights Upfront agenda, which was launched by Ban Ki-moon but has been endorsed by Secretary General Guterres, requires looking at situations like Cameroon, including at the country team level, to prioritize human rights protection in the Anglophone crisis response. So we're looking for the resident coordinator of the United Nations to take this on and publicly address these issues, including by sharing information through the UN system so that the Secretary General is able to raise the situation in Cameroon with the Security Council as a situation that we believe threatens international peace and security. So at this point, I'd like to open up the forum and the floor to questions. We'll begin with Michelle with Reuters. Thank you.
Hi, Michelle Nichols from Reuters. Just following on from what you just said, Akshay, what has been the response from Security Council members when you've suggested that they have a briefing on this? Are you finding that they're receptive?
We're still engaging with Security Council members. I think we hear a lot of lip service at the UN to the idea of protection, but some wariness to adding another situation, particularly another African situation, to a very crowded agenda. As Jonathan said, many believe that Cameroon is an island of stability within a very difficult region. But I think what this report's findings show is that that stability is at risk and that many people are already facing a significant threat. So it's our assessment that that will need to change. Security Council members need to be mobilized to action, and they need to find a place to squeeze this on what is admittedly a very busy schedule that they already have. We have a question from Sherwin.
Yeah, just Sherwin Briceby, South African Broadcasting. Have you engaged with the African Union? I know, based in New York, you tend to lean on the Security Council more, but isn't this a matter that should start in the sub-regional organization?
Yeah, I'll turn it over to our Executive Director for Africa, Mausi.
It is on. It is. Indeed, we have it as part of our advocacy plan. As you know, the report is just being released today. We have specific recommendations to the Africa Union and to other regional partners and those who can influence Cameroon. But we believe strongly that with the indication and the body language from the Cameroonian authorities, there is an interest in, acting on some of the recommendations targeted directly at the government. We will engage with the AU and, other regional mechanisms to strengthen and support Cameroon in doing the right thing and, engaging perhaps, I think the critical thing we need now is a moderating voice someone to mediate between the separatists and the government, and we think very strongly that the AU and individuals within the continent might be able to play that role.
Thank you, Mausi. I'll also add that on page 8 of the report, you'll find recommendations that we direct to the African Union, and these touch not just on pressuring the government, but also addressing the actions of the armed separatists, especially to end all attacks on civilians, including facilitating the immediate resumption of schools. And as you heard from Jonathan, thousands of children have been out of school because of these attacks, which have affected all types of schools, Anglophone and Francophone. Any other questions? Evelyn, please.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. What is the resident coordinator doing, if anything? And the moderating voice, you expect that to come from the AU or from Cameroon itself?
So I'll take this.
Yeah,
Yeah. In terms of the UN's response on the ground, I think it's been quite severe, in fact, severely limited at the moment. In parts because the government of Cameroon has been not so welcoming of foreign monitoring or external monitoring, especially in this situation. I think this is a situation that they very much see as internal. Although they have provided access to some UN agencies to conduct assessments, those have been severely limited in parts because of the security situation. There was one attempt by a UN agency, by a cohort of UN agencies to go to the southwest and northwest. They did conduct some work, but were asked eventually to leave the area by the governors. So this is something that is troubling. We followed up on this in our meetings with the government. The government has also not been very forthcoming in allowing the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights to get access to the region. The Commissioner, Zaid, has asked the government twice for access. Twice it's been denied. In conversations I've had with government officials, I've been told that this issue was under study and that they would soon respond. We're obviously urging the government to do that because by allowing external actors, they will be able to themselves get a better view of what is happening, including in areas that they now can potentially not really access. In terms of, and I'm sorry, I forgot your second question.
Mediation.
Yes, in terms of mediation, I think we're at the junction now where the actions of the government, and specifically the arrest of the 47, the earlier arrests of other leaders, have left a lot of political space for the more radical voices to take hold in the Anglophone community. Now we have Anglophone leaders who, by and large, are extreme in their comments, in their stances, in their narratives. They want independence, and that makes it very difficult, obviously, to enter into mediation if, on the other hand, the government is not ready to discuss those issues. So clearly there is a need for de-escalation. There is a need for the more moderate leaders of the Anglophone community to take more space in the political sphere, but then you also need a third party that can be trusted. I know that there have been several actors that have been floated, including the church, for instance. So those are obviously up for the two parties or the several parties to decide, not for us. But it's clear that international actors should propose their services should the government of Cameroon be open to the idea, and leaders in the Anglophone community also allow for that to happen.
Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you. Siapak from Scan News. My question is a bit general. Do you think the human rights from 20 years ago up to now losing to extremism?
I'm trying to understand the question, whether we're losing to extremism, whether we're...
It's human rights, it's the curve of human rights going down and the extremism is coming up?
I mean, I wouldn't say so exactly. Certainly there is a lot more in terms of challenges to human rights values and human rights norms. And extremism, whether it be religious or political or, whatever, form it might take, create a challenge for a human rights response. And you find almost all the time governments resorting to security measures for dealing and which compromise human rights standards and laws as a way of responding to extremism. But I wouldn't say that extremism is taking its place or the place of human rights. I think that without a doubt, the norms have been established. Whether people want to violate them and whether we as the international community want to ensure that there are consequences for these violations, those are different things. So it is the way that we are working human rights that is in challenge. The norms, as a matter of fact, I think almost on a daily basis, you have new resolutions, you have new laws coming into play, responding to situations on ground. But it is the implementation, as always, that has been a challenge, and how we hold people accountable for violations of these norms.
And if I may just continue on this note, this is a perfect case to show that the norms actually can be applied. We have an emerging situation, an emerging conflict. If we want to talk about prevention, if we want to talk about upholding the norms, if we want to set an example for how the UN system and other multilateral systems can actually function, and when we have a government that's also ready to engage on this question, as the government of Cameroon has been doing with us, I think we have here the perfect recipe for a story that could eventually get better and not worse. But action needs to take place now, and not 12 months from now when it lands on the Security Council's table as a grave situation of emerging atrocities.
I think I'll just add one thought to that, which is that as a human rights organization, we're always keen to emphasize that extremism or extremist views in and of themselves are part of any individual's right, actually, to express themselves. Problems come when these actions become violent, when you have violent extremism or abusive extremism. And what we're seeing in Cameroon, what's been documented by my colleagues, is instances where separatists have taken actions which then violate the rights. And so it's really about when these two principles come into tension with one another that we have a situation that's a problem.
Just say something more on that. Could it be because of the UN is not doing much about human rights? So is that enforcing it as it should be?
Well, we are constantly pushing the United Nations to do more to stand up for the victims of human rights abuses and to hold itself to the highest standards. And in this report, one recommendation which we make, which I think is quite an important one because Cameroon provides troops to so many peacekeeping missions, is that the UN conduct its own proper screening of all Cameroonian security forces who are meant to join UN peacekeeping operations. And this is one way to exclude any individual or unit who is suspected of human rights violations, including in the context of these operations in the Anglophone region, from joining the UN forces. This is a way for the UN to use its power, its leverage, and also to hold its own self accountable, to not be enabling or bringing on abusers and giving them a role of being a peacemaker in another country when they're an abuser at home. Are there any other questions? Any journalists with any questions?
Tell me, why is it happening what's happening?
Why?
Why is it?
I think this is a situation that is happening because we have at the moment two parties, two groups, two views of the world that do not coincide and do not want to actually talk with an open mind. We have had, again, demonstrations, peaceful demonstrations in 2016 and in 2017 that were repressed. And they were repressed violently by government security forces. And that has pushed people to take harder measures to combat what they see as a status quo that doesn't work for them. Now, every time the government attacks civilians and does not follow up, sorry, let me rephrase that, every time government security forces attack civilians and does not follow up by providing proper, transparent accountability, you are creating a new soldier in this war. And I've met so many people on the ground who told me, you know, if I had a gun tomorrow, I would be out in the bush, and that is extremely worrying to hear. So, you know, I think what is missing out here is transparency and open-mindedness. Bearing both of these factors, but bearing both, I think we'll have a crisis that will continue to get worse. I'm sorry?
We don't want to get there.
Nobody wants to get there.
We don't want to get there. And I think that, you know, like Jonathan said, the question is about providing a platform for addressing grievance. There is grievance. People are agreed. It started very mildly. As you would find, you know, when you read the report about the historical factors that led to this, there were peaceful protests at the beginning. And that could have led to some concrete resolutions on both sides. If, you know, I think that the government going in to shoot into the crowds, to arrest people, to kill protesters, to shut down the internet, it was introducing violence into what could have been a dialogue. And that's why we're here today, and we can't stop it. That's the title of the report. These killings, this violence can be stopped.
All right. Thank you. I don't see any further questions for the panel.
He has a question.
So I'd like to acknowledge a gentleman from the delegation of Cameroon to take the floor.
There's the microphone.
No? Okay, sorry.
Okay.
Sorry, my apologies. I'm Sherman Bryce-Lees. I'm the president of the UN Correspondents Association. This is a press conference open to the media. Now, I understand that there are some things that you want to put on the table, but that hasn't been cleared with our committee. This is a press conference open to journalists. We let you come and sit here as a courtesy to the Cameroonian delegation, but this is a press conference open to the media. And if there are additions that you would like to make, you should do that in a process where you consult with my office first before. I mean, this is a Human Rights Watch briefing. So we have house rules. Generally at UN, diplomats not allowed in the press briefing rooms to begin with. But as a courtesy to you, we thought we'd let you come in here, but we do not want to give you the floor here without you consulting us first. Because I see you have a report in your hand there that you want a counter-report. It hasn't been cleared with our committee that approves these press conferences. So with the utmost of respect, I'm going to decline you the floor because this is a press conference open to only journalists. So please talk to us afterwards. The journalists are here. The Cameroonian delegation is here. You're welcome to speak to them outside. And if you want to have a briefing here, come and speak to us, and we can certainly make that happen. Okay?
I would point out, however, just before we finish, that there is an extensive response by the government that is printed in the report and that everyone can consult at the very end of this report, page 52. Thank you.
So with that, then I'd like to wrap up the press conference. Thank you for your attention and for joining us today. My colleagues Malcy and Jonathan are available for individual interviews and also available to speak in French for any outlets who are interested. Thank you.